Nietzsche says that at the heart of every society, there's something at which we are categorically forbidden to laugh, a central piety. There was a time in America when that was God. Today, of course, our pieties, all centered on the aggrieved groups who have the greatest of all contemporary privileges, the privilege of having their purported oppression be recognized by the state. Black people first and foremost, followed closely by women, especially if they're childless, followed closely by members of the so-called LGBTQ community, with Hispanics, Muslims, Native Americans, and the disabled trailing far behind. Jews were once on the list, but they're in the process of being recast as oppressors. You see, the left likes victims of the Nazi Holocaust. They do not like manly IDF soldiers fighting Hamas savages. What I want to focus my remarks on today is a corollary to Nietzsche's observation. At the heart of every society, there are certain enemies who must be hated. I don't think you need to be a disciple of Carl Schmitt to see that political life is inextricably bound up with the distinction between friends and enemies, between us and them. And in a healthy polity, I think the us would encompass all of our fellow citizens, and the them would point to some concrete foreign enemy. Now, you wouldn't need to be in a constant war footing with that enemy, but countries need enemies. They bind the people together. Just look at Israel. They were almost on the verge of civil war before the barbaric attacks of October 7th reminded all of them that they're Israelis first and pro or anti-Bibi second. But what happens when you embrace a worldview that denies the existence of foreign enemies and instead believes that we are heading towards some sort of a universal and homogeneous state? Here is where I think Schmitt got it wrong. He claims that liberals deny the friend-enemy distinction. In truth, they very much uphold it. It's just that they apply it to domestic politics instead of foreign policy. As my friend Dave Raboy has so astutely observed, Democrats don't have foreign enemies. They have foreigners who remind them of domestic enemies. Who then are the domestic enemies of the regime? Well, there's two ways to approach this question. The first, which I don't want to spend too much time on, would be to look at the particular enemies of the regime, i.e., the individuals and institutions which the state tries to imprison and bankrupt with varying degrees of success. So think, obviously, of the foremost candidate for the presidency, Donald J. Trump. But think also of Jack Phillips. Everyone's heard of him, right? Who is now in his 10th year of incessant legal battles. Why? Because he refuses to bake cakes for gay weddings, while he will, however, serve all customers. Or think of Lauren Handy. She was sentenced to 57 months in prison for protesting, not mostly peacefully, but fully peacefully, in front of a DC abortion clinic that was credibly accused of performing partial birth abortions. If there is a silver lining to the persecution of enemies of the state, it is that, for the time being, with the exception of Jeffrey Epstein, the state does not murder them. Now, the regime's lawfare extends not just to individuals who challenge it, but also to institutions that do not toe the party line. Do you remember when Lois Lerner's IRS was targeting the Tea Party groups during the Obama administration? Or when the IRS, during the Obama administration, leaked the donor list of the National Organization for Marriage in order to hurt them? Or look at what's going on right now with VDARE. VDARE is an anti-immigrant website run by Peter Brimelow. They've spent the last 3 years fighting off an investigation by New York's AG Letitia James. They've also been kicked off of Facebook, YouTube, PayPal, Constant Contact, and Airbnb, among other businesses, that are permitted to deny services to a nonprofit on ideological grounds. If you're lucky, the punishment is the process. If you're not, you end up broke and incarcerated. I don't think I need to tell you that while the law comes down hard on these and other political dissidents, people who riot and loot on behalf of approved causes are either not prosecuted, like the recent wave of pro-Palestinian mobs, or they get off pretty lightly. The average prison sentence for the few BLM rioters who have been prosecuted is 27 months. It's not a double standard. It's Sam Francis's concept of anarcho-tyranny, just expanded and applied more aggressively. The tyranny, that is the draconian enforcement of the laws, applies not just to ordinary citizens, but also to political and ideological enemies. And the anarchy, or the non-enforcement of laws, extends beyond petty criminals to politically well-connected individuals and disorderly groups whose causes are blessed by the regime. That, however, is not my focus today. I want to look at another category of enemies, and who are not targeted the same way as these individuals and institutions. Instead of being prosecuted and investigated, they are excoriated and humiliated. And they are not demonized primarily for what they do, but for who they are. Whites, first and foremost, who belong to the accursed race that has wrought so much misery upon the rest of humanity, followed closely by men whose toxic effusions of masculinity threaten women and other men everywhere, followed lastly by Christians, who still cling to their repressive sexual morality and want to impose it on others. At its core, the regime today is anti-white, anti-male, and anti-Christian. Whites, men, and Christians are the wicked triune that stands opposite to the left's holy trinity of BIPOCs, women, and the LGBTQ. But in the secular church of wokeness, the ruling passion is not love, it is hate. The left ultimately hates whites more than it likes people of color. I don't know if any of you have the misfortune to live in one of these neighborhoods that is festooned with these ridiculous lawn signs that boldly proclaim to all who already agree with them, and at no risk to themselves, hate has no home here. If there is one thing you can be sure of, is that hate most definitely has a home there. Whites as a collective are the regime's most explicit object of hate. The old Black Power mantra that we should fill ourselves with hate for all things white has become the ruling class's mantra. I don't think this should be a controversial position at NatCon in 2024. But, lest I get accused of hyperbole by some, just consider the jubilatory response of the establishment to the so-called browning of America. That is, the intentional demographic transformation of America into a majority-minority country through large-scale immigration. So the target date, I don't know if you know this, used to be 2047, but after the last 4 years of untold millions of, I think they're called aspirational Americans, is the correct nomenclature, who've streamed in through our borders, who knows when whites will be reduced to a minority in America. Now, if someone on the right has the temerity to simply notice the very same demographic trend lines which the left celebrates, then that person must be a white supremacist. If I may adapt a line from the great Michael Anton, it's not happening, it's a good thing that it is, but you're literally a Nazi for saying so. And you know that they will not be satisfied when whites are 49% of the population. If there is an outer limit to how non-white America should become, it has yet to be stated. The same principle, of course, applies to all Western nations. Whites, who are already a global minority, just 16% of the total population, must be reduced to minorities within their own countries. Hence, the uncompromising fanaticism on large-scale third-world immigration. It goes without saying that there is no comparable effort to whiten Asian, African, and South American countries. What diversity ultimately really means is fewer whites. In the end, it may well mean no whites. Whites are bad, non-whites are good. It really is that simple. And on this point, the regime really does converge with the unhinged theology of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X, who claimed with a straight face that whites were a race of devils engineered by the dissident angel Jacob on the Greek island of Patmos, preached, "The red, the brown, and the yellow are indeed all part of the black nation," which means that black, brown, red, yellow all are brothers. All are one family. The white one is a stranger. He's the odd fellow. Or as it's called at our elite universities, freshman orientation week. Now, obviously, there is no comparable effort to eliminate men, but there is one to feminize them. America today is a gynecocracy. Now, when I say this, I obviously don't mean that we are literally ruled by women. We've never had a female president, and when we do, and heaven forbid it won't be Kamala, women will still be underrepresented at the top in most realms. But what if instead of looking at statistical comparisons between men and women, we instead looked at the character of our society? Would you say that our universities, our Fortune 500 companies, our schools, and increasingly our military and our law enforcement, embody a masculine spirit, combative, ruthlessly competitive, bold, or a more feminine spirit, cooperative, gentle, compassionate? Would you say that America today is driven by the relentless, risky pursuit of excellence in all realms, or more by a desire to make everyone feel safe and included? Would you say that our churches are harder on men who stray or on women who stray? Is the problem in America today that we are too harsh on criminals or that we're too soft on them? America, to say nothing of the rest of the West, is ruled by a feminine spirit that is at war with almost all traditional expressions of masculinity. We expect little boys to behave like little girls, and when they don't, we diagnose them with ADHD and we stuff them with Ritalin. We try to deny men any spaces where they can be in each other's company, unless, of course, the men in question are homosexuals. So the Boy Scouts now admit girls. It goes without saying that the Girl Scouts do not admit boys, unless the boys in question, of course, are wearing a skirt. Or look at the war that they've been waging on fraternities. Now, it is important to note that the regime apparatchiks do not hate men qua men. They don't mind, and often actually quite like, effeminate men, or as Hobbes called them, men of feminine courage. What the regime hates are masculine men who refuse to bend the knee, men who are courageous enough to say out loud what the rest of us are whispering. This, I think, explains in large part the unhinged levels of animosity they have for Donald Trump. Trump is undeniably manly, and for that, he must be destroyed, like all other manly men. And this for the very same reason that James Madison identified in Federalist 57. The ultimate safeguard to liberty is not found in parchment barriers, but in what he called the vigilant and manly spirit which actuates the American people, a spirit which nourishes freedom and in return is nourished by it. And then, of course, there are the Christians, at least those who belong to denominations that have not been conquered by the left. Do you know the simplest way to identify them, by the way? They are not flying the gay flag during the holy month of June, or the rest of the year for that matter. And it is for this precise reason that they are hated. It's not their opposition to immigration or feminism. Look, let's be honest. On these issues, as on many others, the Christian right does not, for the most part, threaten the regime's pieties. They either keep quiet or have drank the Kool-Aid themselves. But Christians are the last large segment of society to still offer some opposition to the left's sexual agenda. And at the end of the day, there is nothing that the left is more passionate about than the vulgar, private sexual pleasures of the last man. Sure, they make a lot of noise about racism and climate change, but that doesn't directly affect them. Sex, however, is the highest pleasure they can imagine, followed closely by dining out. And while the old Christian moral order has almost been completely steamrolled, Christians still stand athwart history yelling stop when it comes to abortion and to the transing and sexualization of children. For make no mistake, the legitimization of pedophilia is already underway. The logic of the sexual revolution necessarily points to it. If children can consent to change their sex, then why can't they consent to have sex with adults? If two 14-year-olds can have sex with one another, then why can't they have sex with a 30-year-old? The Christians' opposition to the sexualization of children, along with their defense of life and their refusal to celebrate homosexuality, are the primary causes of the regime's hostility towards them. Now, I don't think, maybe I'm wrong, we'll find out, that anything I have said is particularly controversial, at least to people who are willing to not listen to the media and trust their own lying eyes. Why then do I say this? Because the right needs to become comfortable openly defending these enemies of the state. Look, it's not enough to quote MLK and forcefully denounce discrimination in the abstract. We need to vocally denounce and forcefully oppose anti-white discrimination. We can't always have Asians as plaintiffs in our lawsuits. Whites are not a race of devils, and it is absolutely unacceptable to malign them collectively, just as it is absolutely unacceptable to discriminate against them in college admissions, in hiring, and in the allocation of government contracts. My friend Jeremy Carl, who is at this conference, just wrote a fantastic book on the subject, which I would highly recommend to all of you if you want to see the real face of systemic racism in the 21st century. It's also not enough to constantly invoke nature, as the right does, and yet only push back on the gynecocracy when it comes to the transing of women's sports. If nature means one thing at the most commonsensical level, it's sexual differentiation. The sexes should mix in most areas of life, but boys and men also need their own spaces. So do boys and girls, for that matter. The right, I think, should champion all-boys schools, and it should promote curricular reforms that appeal to the interests and passions of boys. Less Maya Angelou, more Plutarch. Less volleyball, more wrestling. There is no reason why all red states could not make this a priority. And such reforms, by the way, would reverberate across the entire system. In fact, I cannot think of a single issue that would better improve the right's prospects. Think of it this way. The remasculinization of men is the prerequisite to doing all of the difficult things that must be done to save our country and our civilization. America has always been manly. We took on the redcoats, we tamed the West, we won 2 world wars, and we put a man on the moon. Manliness is as American as apple pie. And I would say to all of you, what does it say about the failure of the right to engage on this issue that young men need to turn for manly advice to a scumbag like Andrew Tate, who's currently awaiting trial for human trafficking and rape charges? The defense of manliness should not be the preserve of the online right. It should be a bread and butter issue for the right. Lastly, it is not enough to defend the religious liberty of all, important as that is. We need to celebrate the wonderful contributions that Christians make to our civic life. I want to end by telling you a little anecdote. I recently met a white, middle-aged evangelical father of 7 who's in the process of adopting a little Ethiopian girl born in DC to a mother who cannot take care of her. Now, he and his wife are not only adopting this girl, but they packed all 7 of their kids to attend a 4-hour mass in Amharic because the mother wanted her daughter to be baptized in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And when I heard that, I thought, who does this? Who takes a child of a different race and creed to raise them as their own when they already have 7 kids of their own? I'm not going to say it's only Christians, but it almost always is. And yet, they are the most demonized group in the public square. What does it say about our country that we allow the one religious group that I am sure volunteers the most, donates the most, and gives back the most to be demonized the most? Let me end by saying this. I think there can be no hope for our great country if the left and the ruling class whose moral opinions are shaped by it are permitted to malign and persecute whites, men, and Christians with near impunity. It's unacceptable and it's un-American. The right must forcefully defend these enemies of the state. Thank you.